You know, the story most of us learn about Islam in America? Well, what if I told you it's pretty much wrong? The real history is so much longer and way more tangled up in the American story than we've ever been led to believe.
So let's just start with a really basic question. When do you think Islam first showed up in America?
Right now you're probably thinking, maybe the 20th century, or, okay, maybe the 19th century with later immigration waves. Nope. The real answer is way, way earlier. Okay, just look at this timeline. It really flips the script. 1492, the very first contact, involved Arabic. By 1503, you have enslaved West African Muslims arriving. And get this, 1527, a man named Mustafa al-Zamouri, a Moroccan Muslim, lands in Florida. That is over 100 years before the Puritans showed up. It means Islam was here, in the Americas, before Protestantism was even a thing. Just let that sink in.
So how is that even possible? How did this all start? Well, for that, we've got to look at our first chapter here, because the way the old world thought about Islam, it completely colored how they saw the new world.
This is where it gets really wild. See, the Spanish didn't show up with a clean slate, not at all. They had just wrapped up an 800-year war against Muslim kingdoms, so everything they saw was through that lens. Columbus's own translator? He tried talking to the native people in Arabic. It's what he knew. When the conquistadors saw indigenous temples, you know what they called them? Mezquitas, mosques. Hernán Cortés said he saw over 400 mezquitas in Mexico. And even the name California? It probably comes from this popular Spanish fantasy novel, where the name of the queen, Calafia, is inspired by the Arabic word for caliph. It was just part of their world.
And check this out, it shows just how deep this all went. The Spanish had this thing called the requerimiento. They'd read it out loud to native people, basically an ultimatum, convert or we go to war. But here's the kicker. That whole practice, they basically copied it from an Islamic military tradition they've been fighting against for centuries. You know, offering terms before a battle? They literally took a page from the playbook of their Muslim rivals and used it to conquer the Americas. Isn't that incredible?
But it wasn't just the conquerors who brought this story here. Not by a long shot. Now let's shift our focus from them to the people they enslaved, because this is where you see the direct arrival of Muslims from Africa.
So, like we saw in that timeline, by 1503, ships are bringing enslaved West African Muslims over. And it's so important to get this part right. These weren't just anonymous laborers. So many of them were educated people. They were literate in Arabic, and they fought back against their bondage from day one.
And their resistance? Man, it was effective. The very first major slave revolt in the Americas, back in 1522, it was led by enslaved Wolof Muslims. They were so good at escaping and organizing that the Spanish governor literally begged the king to stop sending them. In fact, over the next 5 decades, Spain passed 5 different laws trying to ban Muslim slaves from being brought over, all because they were seen as just too rebellious.
But these are more than just numbers and decrees, you know? These are stories about real people. So let's zoom in on 3 men whose lives really bring this forgotten history into focus.
First up, we have Mustafa al-Zamouri. His story is just unbelievable. He's often called one of the very first Muslims in North America.
I mean, his life sounds like a movie. He gets to Florida in 1527, enslaved on the Spanish expedition that just falls apart. He survives that, only to be enslaved by Native Americans. But then, he completely reinvents himself. He becomes a respected healer. He learns multiple indigenous languages, becoming this crucial bridge between groups. And get your head around this. This one man saw more of the land that would become the U.S. than all the Founding Fathers combined. If that's not a classic American story of survival and adaptation, I don't know what is.
Okay, next up is Ayub Diallo. And his story is so important because it shows us how identity was deliberately stripped away.
So Diallo, this educated scholar from West Africa, is enslaved. And right away, they change his name to Job ben Solomon. This wasn't a one-off thing. It was a system. As you can see here, Ayuba becomes Job, Solomon becomes Solomon, Ibrahim, Abraham. They were swapping out Quranic names for biblical ones that sounded kind of similar. It was a conscious effort to erase who these people were.
And for our third story, we have Ibrahima Abd al-Rahman. This man was a prince in West Africa who then spent 40 years of his life as a slave in Mississippi.
When he finally got his freedom, he started touring the North, trying to raise enough money to buy his family's freedom. And how he did it, it's just this incredible act of quiet resistance. He'd write out the Fatiha, the opening prayer of the Quran, on little scraps of paper for people he donated, and he'd let them think it was the Lord's Prayer. He was using his faith, his literacy, as this brilliant subversive tool to save his own family.
Okay, so when you hear stories like that, you have to ask, right? If this history is so rich and these people were so remarkable, why on earth don't we know about it? Well, that brings us to what we could call the Great American Erasure.
So on one side, you've got the story we all get in school. America was founded by Puritans in New England, all about Anglo-Protestant values. Simple. But then on the other side, you have the actual history. America began as this huge, messy, cosmopolitan clash of cultures spanning 2 whole continents. So, how did the simple story on the left completely bury the reality on the right?
A big part of the answer comes down to this one number, 21,000. That's it. That's how many Puritans came over during their main migration. In the grand scheme of things, that is a tiny group. But that tiny group had a huge outsized say in how America's entire story got told.
And here's how they pulled it off. You have to understand the difference between history with a lowercase h and the past with a capital P. See, history is all the messy stuff that actually happened. The past is the neat, tidy story a country tells about itself. And the Puritans, they were master storytellers and institution builders. They founded Harvard, they founded Yale. By controlling education, they got to turn their small local story into the American past. And in doing that, they just wrote everyone else out of the picture.
So you might be thinking, okay, that's interesting history, but why does it matter now? It matters because the echoes of this lost past, they are literally all around us, even today. This history never vanished completely. It just went underground. It survives in our culture, hidden in plain sight. I mean, just look at this line from Toni Morrison's masterpiece, Song of Solomon. Those names she lists, Bilali, which comes from Bilal, Solomon, which comes from Suleiman, these are direct echoes of the names given to enslaved Muslims. The memory is woven right into our greatest art, if you just know what you're looking for. And knowing this completely changes how we should think about some of our most basic American values. We're taught that religious freedom was this gift from the powerful Puritans. But come on, the Puritans were famous for kicking out anyone who didn't pray exactly like them. The real story of religious freedom in America wasn't given from the top down. It was fought for from the bottom up. It was forged by people like Abdul Arman, who refused to let their faith be extinguished.
And that leaves us with a pretty big, and honestly, a kind of unsettling question. If this entire chapter of our history, a story that covers 300 years and 2 continents, could be so totally erased, what else don't we know about who we really are?